The Ossuary Bloom, Chapter 4, Architects of Silence. The silence in Aris Thorne's laboratory was a lie. It was a thin veneer stretched taut over a constant, low-frequency hum, the sound of Æthelgard's failing heart. It vibrated up through the soles of his worn boots, a perpetual reminder of decay. Here, in his cramped sanctuary carved from a forgotten storage bay, the air was a sterile cocktail of ozone from the data servers and the faint metallic tang of recycled water. Yet even with the scrubbers working overtime, he could still smell it, a cloying formaldehyde sweetness that clung to his clothes, a phantom scent from the Ossuary Levels he couldn't wash away. On the central monitor, the recording looped for the 17th time. It was a mess, a corrupted cascade of sensor data from Ossuary Bay 7. The visual feed was a blizzard of static, pixelated snowstorms erupting over a fixed wide-angle shot of cryogenic pods arranged like teeth in a cavernous jaw. The audio was worse. A raw waveform, jagged and chaotic, spiked and fell with no discernible pattern. It was, by any rational metric, noise, the ghost of a power surge, the shriek of dying capacitors, an echo-lost file. But Aris wasn't looking at the data. His eyes were unfocused, staring through the screen, his mind replaying not the recording, but the memory. The cold, the profound tomb-like chill of the ossuary that had nothing to do with the cryosystems. The air, thick and heavy. And then the shimmer, a distortion in the space between pods 1138 and 1139. It began as a heat haze, a pocket of warped light that coalesced, drawing in dust motes and shadows. It had a form, vague, indistinct, but undeniably humanoid. His scientific mind, the part of him that had once mapped the neural pathways of extinct cephalopods from Proxima b, screamed mass hallucination, gas leak, refracted light from a failing lumens tube. It offered a dozen logical explanations, each one more plausible than the truth his own eyes had witnessed. Because the echo had turned. It had tilted its head, a gesture so achingly familiar it felt like a physical blow. The static on the recording hissed, but in his memory he heard a sound, a single lingering note, a resonant frequency that felt less like sound and more like a thought planted directly into his skull. It held a question, a name, his name. He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. The worn synth leather groaned in protest. The echo's form sharpened behind his eyelids. It wasn't just humanoid. The curve of its shoulder, the slight graceful slump. It was a silhouette he had traced with his own hands 1,000 times. The shape of Lyra. He pushed away from the console, the chair scraping against the grated floor. The movement was jerky, a puppet cutting its own strings. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. Numbness had been the first stage, a protective shell of shock that had carried him from the ossuary, past the sterile-faced architect suppression team, and back to this room. But the numbness was cracking. Beneath it, something far more dangerous was stirring. His gaze fell on the corner of his desk. Tucked behind a stack of data slates was a small silver frame, its surface tarnished with the station's relentless humidity. The photo inside was ancient by Æthelgard's standards, a physical print from a time before everything was a file to be corrupted or erased. Lyra. She was laughing, her head thrown back, sunlight from a star 100 light-years away, catching in her dark hair. It was taken on the Odyssey, during the Xylos expedition.
Before everything. Before his ambition had become a singularity, pulling everything and everyone into its orbit. The guilt was a familiar pressure in his chest, a constant low-grade ache. But now it was different. It was sharper, infused with a terrifying new element: hope. A monstrous, irrational hope. He picked up the frame, his thumb tracing the cool glass over her smiling face. Was it you? The question hung in the humming silence. It was the plea of a grieving man, the desperate query of a child seeing ghosts in the dark. But as he stared at her image, the scientist in him, the disgraced, obsessive xenobiologist, began to reassert control. Grief was a fog. Guilt was a weight. But a problem could be solved. His eyes flicked from the photograph back to the chaotic waveform on the monitor. Noise. Random. Meaningless. But what if it wasn't? The universe wasn't truly random. There were always patterns, hidden symmetries. What if resonance wasn't a symptom of decay, but a signal buried in it? A signal that wore the masks of the dead because their neural patterns were the only template available. He put the photo down, placing it carefully beside the monitor. Lyra's smile now seemed less like a memory and more like a challenge. The numb shock that had paralyzed him was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. His grief was not a ghost to be appeased, it was a variable. His guilt was not a sin to be repented, it was a catalyst. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the plastic keys clattering in the quiet. He wasn't just replaying the file anymore, he was dissecting it. New windows opened on the screen. He pulled up a spectral analysis program, an old piece of software he'd designed for decoding alien biosignatures from background radiation. The processor of his terminal whined, straining under the load. He began to write a new filtering algorithm, one designed not to clean up the noise, but to search for repetition within it. A fractal pattern, a harmonic sequence, a single recurring note. He was no longer a man haunted by his past. He was a biologist who had just discovered a new, impossible form of life, and it had spoken to him in a language he was uniquely qualified to understand. The station groaned around him, a deep metallic sigh as some distant pressure regulator failed. A drip of condensation started a slow, rhythmic beat against a pipe somewhere in the ceiling, a maddeningly patient clock. But Aris didn't notice. He was hunched forward, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor, a man praying to an altar of static. He was searching for a ghost in the machine, not to exorcise it, but to capture it, to pin it to a data slate and force it to give him back what he had lost. His quest for redemption had begun, not with a prayer, but with a line of code. The air in the antechamber to Architect's command was as cold and sterile as a memory wipe. It tasted of ozone and chilled recycled oxygen, a stark chemical palette that scrubbed the station's endemic scent of sweet decay from the tongue. Vesper Illyrian stood at perfect attention, her spine a rod of discipline, her gaze fixed on the seamless obsidian door before her. The polished black surface reflected a distorted version of her face. High cheekbones, dark hair pulled back into a severe knot, eyes that betrayed nothing. A mask of placid obedience. Inside her head, however, a storm of unsanctioned data raged. The incident in Harmonization Bay 7 was a contained neural feedback event, classification Gamma 7. The words cycled through her mind, a mantra of officialese. She had rehearsed them until they felt smooth, frictionless, devoid of the jagged truths they were designed to conceal.
Cascading energy spike from the primary conduit resulted in a system-wide resonance echo, standard deviation, contained within 30 seconds by automated protocols. It was a lie of omission, the most elegant and defensible kind, the kind the architects of silence were built upon. The report didn't mention the face that had coalesced from the static, the impossible specific features of her own great-grandmother, a woman dead a century, her body interred 200 levels below in the ossuary. It didn't mention the voice, a digital ghost that had bypassed the speakers and whispered a single forgotten family name directly into the core of her mind. That was not data. That was chaos. That was noise. A faint, almost subaudible chime sounded, and the obsidian door slid silently into the wall. The sparrow's breath hitched, an infinitesimal flaw she instantly corrected. She stepped across the threshold. The command chamber was a void. Unlike the crumbling neo-Gothic grandeur of the station spires, this room was an exercise in absolute minimalism. The walls were matte black, absorbing light and sound. The floor was a single unbroken sheet of polished gray metal. In the center of the vast empty space, a man stood with his back to her, observing a slowly rotating holographic schematic of Aethelgard. The station glowed in ethereal lines of blue and gold, a perfect, idealized system floating in the darkness. This was Prefect Kalen. His uniform was the same simple gray as hers, but his presence filled the room, exuding an authority as dense and cold as a collapsed star. He didn't turn. "Technician Lyrian," he said. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone, utterly devoid of inflection. It was the voice of the great stillness itself. "Your report." Vespera moved to the precise, designated spot, 10 paces from his back. She held her datapad in her left hand, but did not offer it. He would not want to see the raw log. He would only want the conclusion.
The incident in Harmonization Bay 7 was a contained neural feedback event, classification Gamma 7. She began, her voice a flawless echo of her mental rehearsal. A cascading energy spike from the primary conduit, traced to a faulty regulator in sublevel epsilon, resulted in a transient system-wide resonance echo. The anomaly presented a standard deviation from baseline system noise. Her own pulse was a frantic drum against the cage of her ribs. Standard deviation. The lie tasted like ash. The echo had looked right at her. It had known her. Automated suppression protocols engaged and contained the event within 30.7 seconds. No damage to the harmonization apparatus. The subjects, Thorne and Brecker, have been contained and their short-term recall buffered for routine analysis pending your directive. Silence descended again, heavy and complete. Prefect Kalen made a minute gesture with his hand, and the holographic station before him zoomed in, focusing on the tangled, chaotic architecture of the rust gardens. He seemed more interested in the slow decay of the hydroponics sector than the violent schism that had occurred in a high-security neural facility. "The regulator," Kalen said, his voice still a placid current. It has been catalogued for replacement. Yes, Prefect. A work order has been filed. The dregs in Maintenance Section 4 will be assigned. Good. Efficiency is commendable, technician. Your report is a model of concision. He finally turned. His face was ageless, his features handsome in a severe sculpted way, but his eyes were the most unsettling part. They were a pale, washed-out blue, as if they had witnessed so much information they had been bleached of all color, all feeling. He was looking at her, but she felt as though he were looking through her, analyzing the integrity of her structure. You omitted the telemetry spikes from the subject's neural implant, he stated. It wasn't a question. The ones that corresponded with the echo's peak amplitude. Ice flooded Vespera's veins. He knew. He had seen the full log. This was a test. The readings were anomalous, Prefect, she said, her voice remaining perfectly level. Uncorrelated signal noise. To include them would have cluttered the primary findings.
Kalen's lips curved into the barest suggestion of a smile. It held no warmth. It was the satisfied expression of a mathematician confirming a proof. Precisely, he said. Clarity requires omission, technician. Remember that. Our purpose is not to archive every shudder and twitch of this decaying machine. It is to maintain the great stillness. We do not record the noise, only the signal. To document every fluctuation, every phantom reading, every emotional ghost in the system is to invite chaos into the very heart of our order. He took a step closer. The sterile air around him seemed to grow colder. You see, Vespera, truth is not the sum of all facts. It is the careful selection of the facts that matter. The rest is distraction, a dangerous sentimentality. You have demonstrated a clear understanding of this principle today. The praise felt like a brand on her soul. He was commending her for the lie. He was codifying her betrayal as doctrine. The hollowness inside her bloomed into a vast, silent cavern. The face of her great-grandmother flashed in her mind's eye, her expression one of profound, digital sorrow. Your service upholds the balance, Kalen concluded, turning back to the hologram of his perfect, orderly station. Stillness upon you. Vespera executed a flawless slight bow from the neck. And upon you, Prefect. She turned and walked out of the chamber, each step measured, her back straight. The obsidian door slid shut behind her, sealing her once more in the antechamber. For a moment she did not move. She just stood there, breathing in the ozone, letting the silence press in on her. Then a tremor. It started in her right hand, a minute vibration she could not suppress. She clenched her fist, her short, clean nails digging into her palm. The discipline held, but the foundation was cracked. Clarity requires omission. The phrase was a poisoned dart, embedding itself in her conscience. She had chosen the lie. She had chosen the stillness over the truth. She had become what they wanted her to be, a clean, efficient filter for a reality they refused to acknowledge. She leaned her forehead against the cold, unyielding surface of the door, the chill a welcome shock. The distant rhythmic clang of a maintenance drone echoed up from the lower levels, a sound she had heard her entire life. For the first time, it sounded like a hammer beating on a coffin lid. A soft, triple-tone chime emanated from the datapad still clutched in her hand. A priority notification. Her stomach tightened. She lifted the pad, her gaze falling on the stark white text against the black screen. Notification. Access level amended. Security clearance downgraded to Epsilon. Directive. Report to Harmonization Bay 12 for mandatory cognitive recalibration. Her breath caught in her throat. Epsilon, the lowest clearance level, a technician's purgatory. Her report had been a model of concision, yes, but it had also been a flag. Her proximity to the anomaly, to Thorne, had marked her. Kalen's praise was a lie layered on her own. He wasn't rewarding her. He was isolating her. The hunt had begun, and she was no longer the hunter. She was the prey. The air in Hroldar Brekker's workshop was thick enough to chew. It tasted of ozone, hot copper, and the perpetual damp rot of the rust gardens, a compost heap perfume that clung to everything. Bioluminescent fungi pulsed a sickly green-blue from the corroded seams of the walls, their light catching on the million dust motes dancing in the humid air. The only other illumination came from a lattice of salvaged monitors, their screens a chaotic mosaic of diagnostic code and fluctuating power graphs. At the center of this technological nest, Hroldar hunched over his workbench, the muscles in his back corded with tension. His world was reduced to the millimeter of space between a trembling soldering iron and a microscopic contact point. Sweat traced a path through the grime on his temple. The constant groaning hum of the station's life support was a distant bass note, drowned out by the immediate high-pitched whine of an overworked capacitor bank to his left. Fools! They lived in their sterile spires, breathing filtered air and believing in their great stillness, so detached from the grit of the lower levels that they couldn't even keep track of their own secrets. Hrold's decryption rig was a monstrous chimera of scavenged parts. A cooling fan from a decommissioned drone whirred unevenly, lashed to the side of a processing unit he'd stolen from a derelict survey drone 2 years ago. Wires, stripped and spliced, snaked from the unit to a jury-rigged interface cradle where the chip now sat. It wasn't about elegant code breaking. This was a brute force assault. He was trying to overload the chip's physical security protocols by feeding it precisely calibrated chaotic power surges, tricking it into exposing its data core for a nanosecond. A spray of blue-white sparks suddenly erupted from a power conduit snaking along the floor. The lights on his monitors flickered, and the capacitor bank's whine pitched higher into the territory of imminent failure. Hroldar didn't flinch. He just pressed a greasy thumb against a loose connection on his console, his eyes never leaving the cascade of failing encryption keys on his main display. He knew the limits of his gear. He knew the sound of a component about to give up its ghost, could feel the station's fluctuating power grid through the soles of his worn boots. This was his element. In the rust gardens, survival was a constant negotiation with decay. You learned to feel its rhythms, or you became part of it. He wasn't doing this for truth. Truth was a luxury, a philosopher's currency. Hroldar dealt in echoes. And this chip, this was the score of a lifetime. The data on it, whatever it was valuable enough for the architects to encrypt it with military-grade security. Black market data brokers would pay a fortune for even a fragment. Enough to get out of the gardens, enough for clean water for a year, maybe even a new set of rad scrubbers for his lungs. He could almost taste the clean metallic tang of filtered water, feel the blessed relief of air that didn't feel like breathing soup.
His gaze drifted for a second to a small, faded hollow portrait taped to the edge of a monitor. a young girl with his eyes, smiling a gap-toothed grin. The radiation had taken her, the slow, patient poison of the rust gardens, the architect's neglect. His cynicism was a callus grown over that wound, thick and hard. This chip wasn't just a payday. It was a clawback, taking something from the people who let the rot fester. He refocused, his knuckles white as he adjusted a dial. The screen flashed a new warning. Fatal voltage error. Purge imminent. "No, you don't," he hissed, his fingers flying across a salvaged keypad. He slammed a sequence of override commands, a desperate, angry prayer to the machine gods. His rig was fighting him, the stolen components protesting the unnatural demands. The whine of the capacitors became a physical pain in his ears. He risked a glance at the power conduit. It was glowing a dull, angry red now, the insulation beginning to bubble and smoke. He had seconds. Frustration boiled over into pure, cold focus. The rest of the world fell away. There was no station hum, no dripping condensation, no cloying sweetness of decay. There was only the chip, the current, and his will. He bypassed the main bus, shunting the entire load from the failing capacitor bank directly into the chip's interface, a final, suicidal surge. For a moment, everything went silent. The high-pitched whine died with a pathetic pop. The monitors blanked, plunging the workshop into the dim, pulsing gloom of the fungi. Hrodar held his breath. He'd either fried it to a useless slag, or... With a flicker, the main screen came back to life. No more cascading error messages, no more locked encryption walls. Just raw, fragmented data, scrolling in a chaotic stream of green text. Log 77B Alpha, RESONANCE, Event 4.2, Suppression Protocol _ Gamma. Location, SSUSLVL, Prime Sector 09. Biometrics, anomalous. Waveform mirrors. The text was jargon, mostly, architect technical gibberish. But then a new line scrolled past, and Hrodar's eyes narrowed. Cross-reference, subject THORNE, comma, A. Xenoneurology DIV, status disgraced, under surveillance. Thorne. Dr. Aris Thorne, the echo-lost ghost of the Science Spire. The man who'd lost his wife on some forbidden expedition. A pariah. A man the architects were watching.
A slow, grim smile spread across Hrodar's face. The kind of smile that wasn't born of happiness, but of opportunity. This changed things. Selling the raw data was one thing, risky, but profitable. But a name was leverage. A name was a crowbar you could use to pry open doors you weren't supposed to know existed. This chip wasn't just a commodity anymore. It was a weapon. He deftly copied the entire data cache to a hardened, anonymous drive of his own, the click of the transfer completion a definitive sound in the sudden quiet. He pulled the drive, its casing warm in his palm. He looked from the drive to the name still glowing on the screen. This disgraced Dr. Thorne was at the center of this. The architects were interested in him, and now so was Hroldar Brecker. Maybe it was time to move beyond simple selling. Maybe it was time to invest. The official channels were sealed tombs. Aris had spent the last cycle sending encrypted communiques, citing his station rank and past commendations, requesting access to ossuary level incident reports. The replies, when they came at all, were masterpieces of bureaucratic nullification. Under review. File integrity compromised. Query does not align with protocols for the maintenance of the great stillness. He slumped back in his chair, the worn synth leather groaning in protest. The laboratory was silent, a state he'd once cherished. Now the quiet felt suffocating, a heavy blanket pressing down. It was the same silence that had followed Lyra's final breath. In the stillness of his lab, the station's ever-present hum seemed to deepen, a subvocal groan from the very bones of Æthelgard. Condensation traced a slow path down the plasteel of the large observation window, blurring the distant swirling blues and ambers of the gas giant below. This place, once his sanctuary of logic and reason, had become a cage built from his own failures. His gaze fell upon his primary workstation, its screen displaying the last polite refusal from some nameless technocrat in Viridia Spire. The Aris Thorne of 5 years ago would have accepted it. He would have drafted another, more carefully worded request. He would have followed the rules, trusting the system that had given him everything, and then taken it all away. That Aris was a ghost, a fossilized memory.
The real Aris, the one who saw Lyra's face in the shuddering static of a dead woman's cryogenic pod, was someone else entirely. A heretic, a man willing to burn down the temple to see what was buried in its foundations. He pushed himself away from the desk, his movements stiff. The air was thick with the scent of his own work, the faint, cloying sweetness of nutrient gels for extinct floricultures, overlaid with the sharp tang of ozone from a nearby power conduit. He crossed the room, his worn boots making no sound on the grated floor panels. His destination was a section of wall that looked like any other, a sheet of tarnished brass-colored metal riveted into the station's curving hull. But near the bottom, almost invisible in the perpetual gloom, was a maintenance plate no larger than his hand, its service designation long since scraped away. His fingers, trained for the delicate work of neural mapping, trembled slightly as he pried at the edge of the plate. It resisted, sealed by decades of grime and atmospheric pressure. He grunted with effort, a raw sound in the sterile quiet. With a final, sharp tug, the plate came free with a dry screech of metal on metal. Behind it lay not the expected tangle of fiber optics and power lines, but a recessed port, an archaic design from Æthelgard's founding years. It predated the architects and their pervasive system of control. It was a back door, installed by the original engineers, forgotten by all but the station's most dedicated archaeologists of decay. Aris retrieved a coiled bundle of black cable from a locked drawer, a piece of contraband he'd acquired from a dreg in the Rust Gardens for a month's worth of synthesized protein bars. One end of the cable slotted into the ancient port with a solid, satisfying click. The other he connected to a secondary console, a stripped-down, ruggedized unit he kept hidden beneath a pile of decommissioned sensor arrays. He powered it on. No welcoming chime, no holographic logo, just a single amber cursor blinking expectantly on a black screen. This was the raw nerve of the station, a place where the architect's ideology of stillness held no sway. He began to type. The click-clack of the keys was unnaturally loud. Each command felt like a stone thrown into a perfectly still lake. He wasn't just breaking rules. He was violating the core tenet of his entire world, the pursuit of forbidden memory, the ultimate sin.
He initiated the first program, a code slicer named Leave. A cascade of text scrolled up the screen, a waterfall of system directories and security protocols. Red lines of code appeared, blocking his path. Firewalls, the architect's digital sentinels. They were old but layered thick, like scar tissue. His own code fought back. He wasn't a master slicer like the data thieves of the black market, but he understood systems. He understood patterns. He targeted the seams, the places where old infrastructure had been patched over with new. It was like dissecting a fossil, searching for the hairline fractures that would allow him to crack the whole thing open. The console emitted a low, straining hum. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing the lines of worry etched there. Every few seconds he would pause, listening. Was that the distant clang of a maintenance drone, or the magnetic clamp of a security team's boots on the corridor floor? The first firewall collapsed. The amber text on his screen turned a brief, triumphant green before resuming its scroll. Access granted. Sector 7G. Archival. Read only. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was shallow-level stuff. Public records, station history, the sanitized version at least. He needed to go deeper. He initiated a second program, a brute force worm he'd written himself, codenamed Orpheus. Its purpose was singular, to hunt for a specific data signature through the labyrinth of the deep archives. He had to be precise. One wrong command, one flagged query, and the system would lock him out, triggering every alarm between his lab and the architect's central command. He leaned closer to the screen, the amber light painting his face in a sickly glow. He typed the search parameters, his fingers moving with a sudden, desperate certainty. The hesitation was gone, burned away by the heat of his obsession. Recklessness was all that remained. Search query: Thorne, Lyra, IDK 77B0A1. Come on, Lyra. Where are you? He added the filters. File type .medrec.neuroscan. Date range pre-mortem. He was looking for the last records taken of her mind, the charts from the medbay after the accident on Xylos, the data the expedition overseers had classified as irrelevant to incident report, the data he had been too grief-stricken, too guilt-ridden to fight for at the time. He hit enter.
The console's hum pitched higher, a pained whine. The screen flooded with gibberish, a torrent of alphanumeric chaos. This was the system fighting back, throwing up chaff, trying to confuse the worm. A small window opened in the corner of the display. Trace detected. Location ping initiated. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. They were looking for him. He had seconds. He didn't pull back. He pushed forward. He initiated a masker protocol, a dirty piece of code that would bounce his signal's origin point through a dozen dead nodes in the Rust Gardens. It was a temporary fix, a lie that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, but it might buy him the minute he needed. The red text of the trace warning flickered, then vanished. A hollow victory. Then, amidst the scrolling chaos, a single line of clear, steady amber text appeared. 2 files found. Med record final L Thorne _classified.arc. Neuroscan postmortem L Thorne _redacted.dat. He stared, his breath caught in his throat. It was them, the ghost in the machine, the memory he was willing to sacrifice his future for. Initiate transfer? Y or N? The cursor blinked, a patient, indifferent question. This was the final step,
the point of no return. Once those files were on his local drive, he was no longer a grieving scientist pushing boundaries. He was a criminal, a possessor of forbidden knowledge, an enemy of the great stillness. He thought of the rules he had lived by, the structures he had trusted. He thought of his career, now a ruin. He thought of the man he used to be. Then he thought of Lyra's face, not as he remembered it, warm and alive, but as he had seen it in the ossuary, a mask of cold fury worn by a stranger. His finger jabbed the Y key. A progress bar appeared, crawling from left to right with agonizing slowness. 1%, 2%. The console's whine settled back into a low hum. The immediate danger had passed. Now there was only the terrible, thrilling weight of his choice. Each percentage point was a shackle locking him to this path. With each bite that trickled across the void, he was betraying his old self, murdering the man who believed in order, and giving birth to the man who would stop at nothing for a ghost. The transfer completed. Files secured. Connection terminated.
The screen went black, the single amber cursor winking out of existence. The only light was the dim emergency glow of the lab and the swirling cosmos outside his window. Aris disconnected the cable, his hands steady now. He replaced the hidden plate, the scrape of the metal sealing his crime. He stood in the center of his lab, the silence now deeper, heavier, charged with the data resting on his hidden drive. He hadn't found his answers yet, but he had the lockpicks. He had crossed the Rubicon. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he would never be going back. The air in Hraldar's workshop was thick enough to drink. It carried the signature bouquet of the Rust Gardens, the rich, loamy scent of decaying hydroponic matter, the sharp metallic tang of perpetual damp, and an undercurrent of ozone sizzling off overworked electronics. A single rusted bucket in the corner collected the steady drip, drip, drip of condensation weeping from an overhead conduit, a relentless metronome marking the slow decay of Aethelgard itself. Hraldar Brecker paid it no mind. His world had shrunk to the 14 inches of a flickering, scavenged monitor. His calloused fingers were still, resting beside a keyboard worn smooth by a dead man's anxiety. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, tracked the frantic cascade of alphanumeric gibberish scrolling down the screen. Each line was a failure, another dead end in the labyrinthine encryption of the chip he'd palmed from the ossuary level floor. He felt the familiar gnaw of doubt in his gut. This was a fool's errand, burning power he didn't have, chasing a ghost. Power was rationed down here in the dregs. It meant another half-cycle of cold nutrient paste, another hour spent in the oppressive dark when the rig was off. All for what? A glimpse of something he shouldn't have seen. The pristine white boots of an architect suppression squad. The unnatural stillness of a body bag that had twitched. And this chip, discarded in their haste. Stillness upon them, indeed. The architects preached their tranquil oblivion, their great stillness, but they moved with the frantic energy of men trying to plug 1,000 leaks in a crumbling dam. That twitch, that haste, that was a lie. And in Edelgard, a lie was a vulnerability. A vulnerability was leverage. And leverage, for a man like Hudar, was the only currency that truly mattered. More than echoes, more than favors, it was the raw material of survival.
The decryption program, a snarling beast of his own cobbled-together code, slammed against another wall of security. The screen flashed red. Integrity check failed. Purging kernel. Hudar's jaw tightened. He'd seen architect-grade encryption before, traded on the black market by disgraced technicians. It was elegant, layered like spun glass. This was different. This was older, brutish. It was less a wall and more a series of blast doors, each one slammed shut with paranoid force. He leaned forward, the stool groaning under his weight. The heat from the processing unit washed over his face, smelling of hot dust and melting insulation. He initiated a different protocol, a slower, dirtier one that didn't try to pick the lock, but simply beat on the door until the hinges gave way. The fans on his rig whined in protest, their pitch rising to a desperate hum. The lights in his workshop flickered, dimming in sympathetic misery. He thought of his daughter, Ilara. The thought came unbidden, as it often did in the quiet, humming dark. He didn't see her face, not anymore. The memory suppressors in the recycled air and water did their work slowly, sandblasting the fine details over the years. Now she was just an ache, a phantom limb, a ghost created by the same systemic rot that he was now trying to exploit. The slow seeping radiation from the decommissioned reactor beneath their feet, the one the architect swore was stable, that was the source of the sickness that had taken her. His survivalism was not a philosophy, it was a scar. Trust was a weakness, because the system you trusted would always let you die for its own convenience. And here he was, trusting a hunch, betting precious resources that the architect's convenience had slipped for a moment. A new sound cut through the dripping and the humming, a soft chime, a single pure note in the symphony of decay. Hudar's breath caught in his throat.
On the screen, the waterfall of code had ceased. The angry red warnings were gone. In their place, a block of stark, clinical text glowed a placid green. He leaned closer, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the workbench. His eyes scanned the words, his lips moving silently. Memorandum for internal review, eyes of silence only. His heart gave a heavy thump. This was it. Not some low-level tech report. This was from the inner circle. Subject: Unstable Memory Propagation Event, Ossuary Sector 7G. Incident: Ref 77 KILO Delta. Analysis: The containment breach appears to originate from a diagnostic feedback loop within the primary comms relay, sublevel gamma. The resulting signal cascade has induced a Class 3 UMP event. Propagation patterns are inconsistent with previous models, recommending immediate signal dampening and protocol veil of stillness. Further analysis is required to determine the nature of the emergent resonance signature. He read it once, then a second time, a third. The technical terms were mostly beyond him. Diagnostic feedback loop, emergent resonance signature. It was the sterile language of the technocrat class, designed to obfuscate. But Hroldar was a scavenger. He knew how to find the meat on a carcass, and certain words stood out like shattered bone. Containment breach. Not a glitch, not a malfunction, a breach. Something got out. Unstable memory propagation. He thought of the slang, the curse spat at those whose minds were addled. Echo lost. He thought of the whispers on the black market, of dealers peddling chips that held fragments of a loved one's laugh, a last word, memories, unstable memories, and the architects were fighting to contain them. In the ossuary, no less, where they kept the dead. The focused intensity in his gut dissolved, replaced by something cold and sharp. A slow, cynical smile stretched his lips, a rectus that didn't touch his eyes. This wasn't just a lie. This was a fundamental truth of the station, hidden under a mountain of doctrine and doublespeak. The dead weren't still. And the architects knew it. They had protocols for it. Protocol veil of stillness. Even their cleanup operations were branded with their pathetic ideology, inconsistent with previous models. So it had happened before, often enough for them to have models of it? This particular event was just different. Worse, maybe.
He let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. All their talk of tranquility and order, all their neural harmonizations to keep the living quiet, it was all a sham. They were terrified. They weren't shepherds guiding a flock. They were zookeepers who'd lost control of a predator. And he had a piece of its feeding schedule. More than that, he had a location, sub-level gamma, a place, a tangible, physical place where this propagation originated. That was the real prize, not the what, but the where. Hroldar leaned back, the ancient stool creaking a final mournful complaint. The workshop was the same, the dripping, the humming, the smell of rot, but the universe had shifted on its axis. He was no longer just a scavenger, picking at the station's scraps. He was a man holding a map that led to the heart of the lie. Secrets were currency. He knew that. But this wasn't just a pocket full of echoes. This wasn't leverage for better rations or a blind eye from a corrupt security drone. This was power. Raw, world-breaking power. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Hroldar Brecker felt something other than the gnawing ache of survival. He felt the greedy thrill of opportunity. Aris Thorne's laboratory was a sarcophagus for dead ideas. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the singular beam of light from his console, a silent ballet in the stale air. The room was his private ossuary, crammed with the skeletons of obsolete xenobiology equipment and the ghosts of failed hypotheses. It smelled of ozone, the sharp, sterile bite of an overworked processing core, layered over the station's perpetual musk of recycled water, and the cloying sweetness he'd long ago identified as a byproduct of the failing hydroponics in the rust gardens. Outside, the low, constant hum of Aethelgard's life support was a prayer to a dying god. Inside, the only sound was the frantic clicking of his fingers on the worn, smooth keys. He had the data, a raw, corrupted slice of the energy cascade from the harmonization chamber, smuggled out on a microdrive Hroldar had palmed him. An anomaly, a ghost. That's what Vespera's superiors would call it, a system glitch. But Aris knew energy. He'd spent his life mapping the faintest neural whispers of creatures dead for millennia. This was not a glitch. A glitch was chaos. This was something else.
On the main holographic display, the energy signature writhed, a chaotic scribble of jagged peaks and deep, unsettling troughs, rendered in a sickly green light that cast his face in a ghoulish pallor. It looked like a scream given form, a furious, incoherent signal that had burned itself into the chamber's systems.
He ran a fractal analysis, his third of the cycle. The program chugged, the console's fans whining in protest. He leaned closer, his breath fogging a small patch of the cold glass screen. "Come on," he whispered, the words swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "Execute pattern recognition subroutine. Cross-reference against known energy phenomena. Station-wide database." The console chirped a confirmation. Lines of text scrolled cast, a waterfall of negatives. Not plasma discharge, not a feedback loop from the biostorage cryo units, not a residual effect of the station's failing magnetic shielding. It matched nothing. It was sui generis, an orphan signal born of nothing. Impossible. Aris murmured. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture automatic, weary. Nothing is born from nothing. Causality was the last religion he had left. He isolated a segment of the waveform, magnifying it. The jagged lines resolved into a finer, more complex structure. It was still chaotic, but within the chaos there was a rhythm, a cadence, a complex repeating motif that was almost biological. He felt a prickle of unease, the kind that came just before a breakthrough or a catastrophe. The pattern was familiar, not from any textbook or research paper. It felt personal, a memory on the tip of his tongue, a name he couldn't quite speak. He shook his head, dismissing it. Pareidolia, the desperate attempt of a human mind to find a face in the static, a scientist's cardinal sin. Yet the feeling lingered. He'd seen a pattern like this before, not on a console, but in his mind's eye. The memory was tied to the weight of a scanner in his hand, the cold sterility of a medical bay, and the scent of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against the perfume of fear. It was tied to Lyra.
His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He kept her final scan. The thought was a transgression, a secret shame he'd buried for years. He'd taken it on Xylos, just hours before the expedition collapsed, before his ambition had led them into the storm that took her. He'd told himself it was for science, to preserve the neural map of a brilliant mind. But it was a lie. He did it so he wouldn't lose all of her. A digital ghost to keep in a digital box. Accessing it was forbidden. Architect protocol scrubbed such personal data from all but the most secure hidden archives. But this lab, this console, was his, a relic from his past life, firewalled and isolated. He had a copy, a single encrypted file labeled only with a string of prime numbers. His hands trembled as he navigated through layers of his own esoteric security. It was a stupid risk. If Vespera was right, if the architects were already suspicious, this would be an open admission of guilt, possession of unapproved memories. But the itch of the unknown was worse than the fear of being caught. The scientist in him, the obsessive, grasping part that had cost him everything, was now screaming for an answer. He typed the final decryption key. The screen flickered, and a new window opened. It was beautiful. A delicate, shimmering web of light, a galaxy of interconnected thoughts and memories, rendered in soft blues and warm golds. The complete neural signature of Lyra Thorne, the architecture of her soul. For a moment, he forgot the chaotic green scribble that still pulsed in the adjacent window. He just stared, lost in the silent perfection of who she had been. Then his resolve hardened. This wasn't a memorial. It was a data point. He had to know. "Initiate comparative analysis," he commanded, his voice tight, strained. "Source alpha, resonance waveform. Source beta, file prime minus 7,193. His console, a machine that had mapped the complexities of alien brains, hesitated. The command was nonsensical. It was like asking it to compare a supernova to a symphony. One was raw, chaotic energy. The other was structured, biological information. The system flashed a query. Incompatible data types. Probability of meaningful correlation. 0.001%. Proceed. "Proceed," Aris said, the word a splinter in his throat. A progress bar appeared. It crawled. 1%. 2. The fans of the console spun into a high-pitched scream, the ozone smell intensifying. Aris held his breath. He expected nothing. A statistical anomaly, perhaps. A 5, maybe 10% correlation from random noise alignment. It would be enough to dismiss the nagging feeling, to put the ghost back in its box, and return to the cold comfort of physics. He watched the number. It ticked past 20%, then 40. His analytical detachment began to crack. Past 60. His breath hitched. 75. 80. The bar reached completion. A number, stark and absolute, flashed in the center of the screen. Correlation. 97.3%. Aris stared. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. The number pulsed. Green on black. A venomous heartbeat. It was an error. It had to be. A catastrophic failure in his comparison algorithm. A phantom artifact from the damaged drive. He ran the diagnostic again, and a third time. The result was the same, unwavering, 97.3%. His hand, shaking violently, moved to another command. Overlay source alpha onto source beta. Visual match. The chaotic green waveform, the one that looked like a scream, moved across the screen. And as it settled over the beautiful, intricate lattice of Lyra's neural map, it locked into place. It wasn't an overlay. It was a key in a lock. The jagged, furious peaks of the resonance energy perfectly traced the major synaptic pathways of her mind. The deep, chaotic troughs fell into the silent spaces between her memories. The incoherent noise suddenly had structure. It had a voice. It was wearing the shape of his wife's consciousness like a tailored suit. Analytical curiosity did not simply shift to awe. It was annihilated. It was a supernova of pure, unadulterated horror. The objective proof he had sought was a curse. His scientific mind, his last bastion of sanity, shattered against the impossible reality glowing on the screen. The resonance was not just some station-wide phenomenon. It wasn't a systems failure or a new form of radiation. It was her. Somehow, impossibly, it was her. Aris stumbled back, his chair scraping loudly against the metal floor. The room felt suddenly freezing. The hum of the station was no longer a hum. It was a whisper. The ghost was out of the machine. and it had a name.
The door to Vesperlirian's quarters sealed with a pneumatic hiss, a sound as clean and final as a surgical incision. It severed the ambient chaos of the Viridia spire, leaving her in a space of monastic quiet. Here there was no scent of decay or the cloying sweetness of formaldehyde that clung to the ossuary levels. The air, filtered to sterile perfection, smelled only of cool ozone and the faint dry heat radiating from the single light strip recessed into the ceiling. It was a perfect rectangle of cold white light, illuminating a room of perfect right angles. Her bed was a slab, the synth fiber sheet pulled taut enough to bounce an echo coin. Her desk was a polished plinth of black polymer. There was no art, no mementos. There was only order. The great stillness made manifest in brushed steel and silent air. Stillness upon you. The greeting was a prayer, a promise, a chain. For the first time in her life, the chain felt heavy. She moved without a sound, her soft-soled technician's boots silent on the polished floor. She didn't activate the main terminal embedded in the wall. That was part of the architect network, its data streams monitored, its every query logged for harmonization review. To use it for this would be an act of overt rebellion. Instead, she retrieved a personal datapad from a hidden compartment beneath a floor panel. It was a sleek, razor-thin sheet of obsidian glass, a perk of her rank she had never thought to use for anything but private study of architect doctrine. Her fingers, long and steady, danced across the surface. The screen glowed to life, its cold blue light casting her face in stark relief. Her expression was a mask of placid control, a face she had practiced in a mirror for years until it became more real than the emotions it concealed. But her heart hammered a frantic, dissonant rhythm against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the station's low, steady hum. She accessed the archives, not through the main portal, but through a deprecated sub-protocol, a technician's back door meant for emergency diagnostics, a digital ghost key. Using it was a risk. Using it meant she accepted that an emergency was already underway, even if she was the only one who knew it. Logs, Ossuary Level, Gamma 7, Cycle 883.21. Tag matches. The official report materialized on screen. It was insultingly brief. Event ID 94 Theta. Status contained. Summary: anomalous energy fluctuation detected within cryogenic storage array 1138. Mino-resonance manifestation. Class G, non-corporeal. Suppression team dispatched. System integrity restored. No further action required. No further action required. The words were a sedative, designed to calm, to reassure, to enforce the stillness. The sparrow's thumb traced the edge of the datapad. She had been there. She had seen the suppression team's pulse rifles charge, seen the look on the disgraced xenobiologist's face, Aris Thorne. He hadn't looked at the flickering echo with fear, but with a horrifying, desperate hunger. And she had seen the echo itself. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't noise. It had shape. It had purpose. It had turned its head and looked at Thorne. And later, in the harmonization chamber, the voice of her grandmother, dead 20 years, whispering through the machine, speaking of secrets buried before Vespera was even born. A ghost in the shell, a memory that was not her own. The report was a lie. A neat, tidy, orderly lie. Her loyalty had always been to the concept of order, not to the men and women who enforced it. She had believed them to be a necessary instrument of that order. But if the instrument lies, then the order it creates is a falsehood. The thought was heresy. It felt like a crack forming in the very foundation of her mind. With a deep, steadying breath, she bypassed the summary report. She navigated to the raw sensor data logs, the uncollated, unscrubbed torrent of information captured by the array of passive sensors blanketing Ossuary Gamma 7. The screen dissolved into a waterfall of cascading code and telemetry, atmospheric pressure, gravimetric flux, radiation counts, electromagnetic spectra. It was chaos. It was the antithesis of the great stillness. It was the truth. She began to filter. Her training was precise, her mind a scalpel. She isolated the array 1138. She set the time parameters, bracketing the official event log by a full 60 seconds on either side. Then she began to sift, looking for the trigger. The architects taught that resonance was a system failure, a feedback loop in decaying biostorage hardware. It was entropy, a random surge, like rust or a failing power conduit. But randomness has no voice. Randomness does not whisper your grandmother's name. She filtered out ambient energy readings, the station's constant thrum, the distant whine of the maintenance drones. The noise fell away. She amplified the micro-fluctuations, the whispers of data beneath the roar. Her eyes scanned the graphs, the scrolling lines of light. Nothing. 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 Then she saw it. It was almost invisible, a flicker on the electromagnetic spectrum, a spike so brief, so faint, it was barely distinguishable from background radiation. It occurred 1.7 seconds before the primary energy fluctuation logged in the official report, before the system registered an anomaly, before the alarms. It was the cause, not the effect. Her breath caught in her throat. She isolated the spike, magnifying the data packet. It wasn't a chaotic burst. It wasn't a surge. She ran it through a frequency analysis algorithm, a tool used for deciphering complex signals. The chaotic lines on her screen wavered, then collapsed. They resolved into a perfect, repeating waveform. It was modulated, coherent, structured. It's a signal. It wasn't a system glitch. It was a broadcast, a targeted, deliberate transmission. Something had spoken, and the dead had answered. It was a thought that made the cold, sterile air in her quarters feel thick and suffocating. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled the official report back up, placing it side by side with her raw data analysis. Her eyes darted to the timestamps. Raw log, spike at 883.21, 14.3. Official report, event begins at 883.21, 16.0. A 1.7-second gap. She zoomed in on the official data stream to the space where the signal should be. There was no corruption, no static, no garbled data from a failing sensor. There was nothing. It was a perfect, clean void. The data hadn't been lost. It had been excised, cut out with the precision of a laser, the gap filled with interpolated background noise, so seamless that no cursory check would ever detect it. Deliberately scrubbed, covered up.
The private doubt that had been a hairline fracture in her faith now shattered, spiderwebbing through her entire worldview. This wasn't maintenance. This wasn't containment. This was a conspiracy. The architects of silence weren't just quieting the echoes of the dead. They were hiding the fact that someone or something was trying to speak to them.
Vespera leaned back in her chair, the datapad held loosely in her lap. Its blue light painted her face, but the placid mask was gone. In its place was a chilling clarity. The quiet hum of the station no longer sounded like life support. It sounded like a secret being kept. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her desk. The suspicion was no longer a vague unease. It was a cold, sharp weapon, and she finally understood that she would have to learn how to use it. The laboratory was a tomb of light and shadow. Aris Thorne existed at its center, a hunched silhouette against the churning nebula of holographic data. The air, thick with the station's usual perfume of ozone and recycled water, was sharpened by the hot metal tang of his overworked console. A single rhythmic drip of condensation somewhere in the unlit corners of the room served as a maddening metronome, counting out the hours he'd lost to this hunt. He had the signature, a jagged, violent spike of energy captured during the harmonization chamber's event, the official report which Vespera was now so carefully corrupting, would call a cascade failure, a system glitch. But Aris had been there. He had seen the face of his dead wife, sculpted from light and memory, and he knew a glitch did not have a ghost. A glitch did not whisper your name with another's voice. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. He dragged a projection of the signature across a schematic of Ethelgard's primary power grid. The fit was wrong. It was like trying to force a key into a lock it was never meant to open. The energy spike was too raw, too chaotic. It didn't follow the established pathways. It brute-forced its way through them, leaving behind a trail of fried relays and data ghosts. He slumped back in his worn chair, the synth leather cracking in protest. It was an invasive species, a parasite feeding on the station's electrical lifeblood. The architects, in their sterile wisdom, would want to excise it, burn it out, maintain the great stillness. But that stillness felt like a lie, a tomb's silence. This signal, this resonance, was a scream, and it had screamed Lyra's name.
He closed his eyes, the image of her face in the chamber burning behind his eyelids. The memory was a fresh wound. Was this resonance a second chance, or a second punishment for his failure on Kepler 186F? He opened his eyes, a new resolve hardening his features. If it was a punishment, he would face it. If it was a phenomenon, he would map it. His approach was wrong. He was thinking like a station engineer, tracing a power surge. He needed to think like a xenobiologist, like the man he used to be. The signal didn't originate in the system. It was introduced to it. He killed the modern power grid schematic, the screen going dark for a moment, plunging him into the gloom. The only light came from the eerie pale blue glow of a patch of bioluminescent fungi creeping up a damp conduit in the corner. Old sins, old wires, he whispered to the empty room. His fingers flew across the console's interface, the keys clacking softly. He was diving, pulling up archives so ancient they were flagged with warnings of data degradation. decommissioned station schematics, blueprints from the founding, architectural plans from before the rust gardens were even conceived. A century and a half of digital dust. He requested energy logs from the same era, his console groaning as it tried to process the fragmented, corrupted files. It was data archaeology. For hours he worked. The single drip became the thudding of his own heart. The hum of the console was the only voice in the universe. He layered the resonance signature over the old energy logs, searching for a correlation, a precursor, an echo. Nothing. Just static. Just the random noise of a dying station. Was he just another echo-lost fool chasing phantoms in the code? Was this obsession just another facet of his guilt? Then he saw it. Not a spike, but a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible blip in the energy logs from 7 years ago, logged from a sensor array in the Ossuary Levels and dismissed as harmonic feedback. It was pathetic, weak, but the waveform, the pattern was there, a miniaturized, degraded version of the event he'd witnessed, the ghost's whisper. His breath hitched. He isolated the waveform and created a search algorithm. Scan all archived energy logs, all levels, last 20 years, flag all instances of this pattern, threshold 0.1% variance.
The console whirred, its fans spinning up with a high-pitched whine. Data streams, long dormant, scrawled across the holographic display in waterfalls of amber and cyan. And one by one, the hits came in. 19 years ago, a flicker in the ventilation system of Viridia Spire. 12 years ago, a burst of static in a hydroponics pump in the Rust Gardens. 4 years ago, a sensor ghost near a cryogenic pod bank. Dozens of them, small, insignificant events, all dismissed, all forgotten, all bearing the same spectral fingerprint. "They're not random," he breathed, a manic grin touching his lips for a half-second before vanishing. This wasn't chaos. This was a constellation. He pulled up a new display, a three-dimensional holographic map of Ethelgard, rendered in ghostly blue wireframe. It floated in the center of the room, a skeleton of the station hanging in the dark. He began to plot the coordinates of each minor event, each one appearing as a tiny, pulsing point of red light. He spun the model, viewing it from every angle. The red lights were scattered, seemingly without reason. But they weren't the source. They were the aftershocks, the ripples in the pond. The source was the stone. He started drawing lines, tracing the energy propagation paths backward from each event, using the old brittle schematics as his guide. The lines were vectors, arrows pointing through the station's forgotten anatomy. Slowly, a shape began to form in the chaos. The lines, dozens of them, were not converging on a reactor, not a life support nexus, not even the ossuary itself. They were all leading down, down into the station's deepest, oldest foundations, down to a single, dark, silent node in the wireframe model. He zoomed in. The holographic model grew, the upper levels of Ethelgard flying past his head until he was deep in the substructure, in a sector marked on the schematic as decommissioned 150 years ago. The lines all terminated at one precise point, a small, isolated chamber. His heart hammered against his ribs. He could barely read the faded, archaic lettering on the ancient blueprint. The font was ornate, a relic of the station's optimistic birth. It took his terminal a moment to translate the corrupted text. Primary Communications Relay. Kepler Array.
A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down his spine. It wasn't a power source. It wasn't a storage facility.
It was a communications hub, a colossal antenna built for one purpose: to send and receive signals across interstellar space, to talk to the world they had lost, or to listen to whatever answered. This wasn't a glitch erupting from within the station. It was being broadcast. Aris stared at the single glowing point on the map where all the lines of his grief and obsession had led. The obsessive haze in his mind evaporated, replaced by the cold, terrifying clarity of a man who has just found the heart of the ghost. He had a location. He had a target. The hunt was no longer abstract. It now had an address. The architect maintenance corridor on sublevel Gamma was a cathedral of lies. Vespera had walked its length 1,000 times, her boots echoing on the grated floor with a sound she'd once mistaken for authority. Now it just sounded hollow. The vaulted ceiling, ribbed like the skeleton of some colossal beast, was lost in shadow, its Gothic aspirations choked by bundles of hissing conduits and weeping pipes. The air, a signature Ethelgard cocktail of chilled ozone, recycled water, and the faint, cloying sweetness of formaldehyde that drifted up from the ossuary levels, felt thicker tonight, heavier. It coated the back of her throat. Her mission was simple, and in its simplicity, terrifying. She needed to test the walls of the cage she had only just realized she was in. She needed to see if the silence was merely a habit or if it was enforced. Her eyes scanned the corridor, ignoring the faded gold filigree on the bulkheads for the subtle tells of surveillance, the almost invisible sheen of a lens in a decorative rosette, the slight discoloration on a panel hiding a microsensor. She was one of them. She knew where to look, and they were everywhere. Ahead, a pool of unsteady light from a malfunctioning lumen strip illuminated a lone figure. Junior Technician Lorien. Perfect. He was barely out of his apprenticeship, his face still holding a measure of pallor that hadn't yet hardened into the waxy permanence of the station's lifers. He was kneeling, his back to her, the diagnostic port of a junction box open before him, like a patient etherized upon a table. His focus was absolute. He wouldn't hear her approach over the station's eternal, groaning hum.
She slowed her pace, letting her footsteps soften. The plan was to be an accident, a casual collision of orbits. She adjusted the datapad under her arm, preparing to let it slip. But as she drew closer, she saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine. He wasn't just working, he was hiding in his work, a familiar feeling. She changed tactics. A direct but casual approach would be less suspicious than a staged mishap. She stopped a few feet away, pretending to study a schematic on her own pad. The light from her screen cast her face in a sterile blue glow. She let the silence stretch, allowing him to become aware of her presence on his own terms. After a moment, he shifted, his head tilting. He'd sensed her. He turned, his eyes wide for a second before they recognized her rank and insignia. The fear was instantly sublimated into deference. He scrambled to his feet, wiping a smear of conductive grease from his palm onto his gray coveralls. "Technician Vespera," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Stillness on you." "And upon you, Lorien," she replied, her tone even, measured, the model of an architect's servant. "I didn't mean to disturb your work. Diagnostics on the primary relays?" He nodded eagerly, relieved by the mundane topic. "Yes,
We've been logging phantom power drains across the sector. Nothing critical, just noise. The system craves a cleaner signal." He spoke the words like a catechism, a truth learned by rote. The system craves stillness. This was her opening. Vespera swiped a finger across her datapad, her expression of mild, professional curiosity. "Noise," she mused. "Interesting you should say that. I was reviewing the archival logs from the harmonization event in the ossuary. The malfunction." She let the word hang there, a carefully chosen imprecision. "I noticed a ghost signal in the energy readings just prior. A harmonic flutter, emanating from the lower levels, almost like a feedback loop that wasn't native to the system. Have you ever seen anything like that in your diagnostics? A resonance that doesn't belong?"
She watched him. It wasn't a dramatic change. It was 1,000 tiny, catastrophic collapses occurring at once. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His eyes, which had been fixed on hers with a student's respect, darted to the left, then the right, as if searching for an escape route or an officer who might overhear. His tongue darted out to wet his lips. He swallowed, and the sound was a dry click in the humming quiet of the corridor. He had seen it. The knowledge was there, a terrified animal behind his eyes. Vespera kept her own expression placid, a mask of professional inquiry. Inside, her heart was a cold, heavy stone. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was certain. This was not a glitch in the system. This was a feature. Lorien's gaze snapped back to hers, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a frantic, glassy sheen. The fear was a tangible thing, radiating off him in waves, chilling the air between them more than any faulty life support system ever could. He had been taught this lesson well. The first rule of the architects was not order, it was silence. Technician?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He took a half-step back, his hand brushing against a wrench on his tool cart with a soft clatter. "Anomalies are... they're disruptions. All disruptions run contrary to the great stillness." He was reciting. This was a script, burned into his memory during some harmonization session of his own. "Our duty is to smooth the signal, to ensure tranquility, to not amplify noise by giving it credence." He was lecturing her. A junior technician, his voice trembling, was reminding a senior officer of the fundamental doctrine. It wasn't insolence. It was a desperate plea. "Stop asking. You're putting us both in danger." Vespera felt a profound and sudden isolation, as if a thick pane of glass had just descended between her and the rest of her world. She had crossed a line. By simply asking a question, she had revealed herself as a source of noise, a disruption to the tranquil flow. Lorien wasn't seeing her as a superior anymore. He was seeing her as a threat, as someone echo lost.
"Of course," Vespera said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the hum of the station. "You are correct, technician. The purity of the signal is paramount. Stillness is the goal." She gave him a small, dismissive nod, the kind a superior gives when a conversation is over. She was offering him an out, a way to pretend this never happened. Relief washed over his face so intensely it was almost painful to watch. "Yes, of course. Stillness upon you, technician," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I have to recalibrate the tertiary sensor grid. It's overdue." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed his cart and practically fled down the corridor, his movements clumsy with haste. He didn't look back. Vespera remained motionless,
watching until his form was swallowed by the oppressive shadows and the distant clang of a maintenance drone echoed in his wake. She was alone. The confirmation she sought had come, not in a confession, but in the rehearsed, abject terror of a young man taught that some questions must never be asked. The architects weren't just covering something up. They had built their entire society on a foundation of enforced ignorance, weaponizing fear to maintain a fragile artificial peace. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of screams that no one was allowed to hear. The corridor no longer felt like a cathedral of lies. It felt like a tomb. And for the first time, Vespera understood that she was not one of the keepers. She was one of the buried. The transition was always jarring. One moment, Eroldar was in the dead quiet of a forgotten maintenance artery, the only sound the grit of his boots on the metal grill floor, and the distant, mournful hum of Aethelgard's life support. The next, he pushed aside a heavy, sound-dampening curtain woven from scavenged insulation and stepped into chaos.
The undermarket. It wasn't a place on any schematic. It was a cancer, a necessary tumor grown in the hollow spaces between the rust gardens and the lower pylons of Viridia Spire. The air hit him first, a thick, wet slap of humanity. Sweat, cheap stems, the ozone tang of jury-rigged electronics, and underneath it all, the sweet, cloying perfume of boiling synthetic proteins and the ever-present formaldehyde-laced scent of decay that bled down from the ossuary levels above. Steam billowed from cracked pipes overhead, catching the frenetic light of flickering neon signs and casting everything in a shifting, spectral haze of blue and faded gold. Haraldar pulled the collar of his worn jacket higher, dipping his chin. The first rule of the undermarket was simple. You do not exist. You are a ghost, a shadow passing through. You see nothing, you hear nothing, you are on your way to nowhere. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground 10 feet ahead, a habit ingrained by years of survival. His gaze swept the periphery without moving his head, cataloging threats, escape routes, and opportunities. A dance of practiced paranoia. He moved with the flow of the crowd, a river of dregs and desperate technocrats, their faces pale and slick under the erratic lighting. The noise was a physical pressure, a low-frequency thrum of generators overlaid with 100 hushed conversations, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the sizzle of food stalls, and the distorted, watery warble of music leaking from a stall selling pre-collapse audio files. "Stillness upon you!" The greeting was a lie down here. There was no stillness, only the frantic energy of survival. To his left, a vendor sat cross-legged on a crate, a rack of shimmering vials before him. Authentic memories. Haraldar's eyes flickered over them, each one a tiny universe of stolen light. Sunrise on Viridian Prime, a handwritten label read. A lover's first touch. The taste of real rain. He felt a familiar knot of contempt and pity tighten in his gut. People paid in echoes, the station's pitiful currency, for a few seconds of a feeling they'd never earned, a life they'd never lived. They'd jack the fluid into their neural ports and stare at a bulkhead, their faces slack with second-hand joy, becoming just a little more echo-lost with every dose. It was the architect's great stillness in its most pathetic form, a tranquility bought and paid for, as artificial as the air they breathed. He kept walking.
His purpose here wasn't to buy. It was to think. The tunnels were good for hiding, but the silence bred ghosts. Down here, amidst the desperate and the damned, he could think clearly. The faces of the disgraced doctor and the turncoat architect swam in his mind. Aris and Vespera. An idealist and a fanatic, both convinced they could outsmart the system that had made them. Fools. Vespera wanted to approach Valerius Otho, a disgraced architect living in exile. Her logic was pristine, cold. To defeat the architects, you must think like an architect. Otho would know their philosophy, their protocols, their fears. Hroldar spat quietly onto the grimy floor. Trusting a former ruler to help you tear down his own kingdom was idiocy. Power never truly lets go. It just changes its grip. His gaze caught on another stall, this one nestled in a dark alcove where bioluminescent fungi and cracked jars provided the only light. A man with a face like a collapsed star chart, all craters and lines, was demonstrating a bypass key to a nervous-looking technocrat. The key, a tangle of wires and a repurposed chip, sent a shower of sparks as it touched a salvaged lock mechanism. The lock clicked open. The vendor didn't smile. No one smiled down here. He just nodded, and a small bag of echoes disappeared into his sleeve. That was real. That was tangible. A tool for a job. It was the world of Kalis Vorin. Kalis. The name was a whisper in the maintenance shafts, a legend in the rust gardens. A renegade engineer who had ripped out his own neural implant and gone feral, living in the station's deepest guts. They said he knew Athelgard's bones better than the drones that maintained them. They said he could make a failing fusion reactor sing or silence a surveillance node with nothing but a wrench and a piece of wire. Hroldar trusted that. He trusted grime-caked knuckles and the smell of ozone, not the philosophical ramblings of a deposed tyrant. Kalis was an outcast, a survivor. He was one of them.
A sudden shift in the crowd's current forced Hroldar to step aside, pressing his back against the corrugated metal wall of a food stall. The smell of boiling noodles and synthetic brine was overwhelming. A trio of station security, their gray uniforms clean and starkly out of place, moved through the market. They weren't architect praetorians, just the low-level enforcers who kept the dregs in line, but their presence soured the air. Their eyes scanned the crowd with lazy contempt, looking for an easy target, an excuse to enforce order. Hroldar didn't look at them. He focused on a smear of rust on the wall next to his head, tracing its fractal patterns. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate. Be a stone. Be part of the wall. The security passed, their heavy boots clanging a rhythm of casual authority. The moment they were gone, the market's hum returned to its previous level, a collective exhalation of relief. But Hroldar remained still for a few seconds longer. Across the narrow walkway, a man in a hooded coat who had been examining a vendor's wares had also frozen. He hadn't watched the patrol pass. He had been watching Hroldar. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, no malice, just the flat reptilian assessment of one predator sizing up another. The man gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture of professional respect between ghosts, and then turned, melting back into the river of bodies. An informant. Maybe for the architects, maybe for a rival crew. It didn't matter. It was a reminder. Even down here, in the anarchic heart of the station, the walls had eyes. This was the game Vespera and Aris didn't understand. They saw a heist, a surgical strike for data. They saw schematics and security protocols. Hroldar saw this, 100 hungry, desperate people who would sell you out for a warm meal or a vial of fake sunshine. He saw informants in the shadows and enforcers on the prowl. He saw a complex, brutal ecosystem where trust was a currency more valuable and far rarer than echoes.
He pushed off the wall, the moment of tension stealing his resolve. Vespera could have her philosopher. He would find the engineer. They needed someone who knew how to break things, not someone who knew why they were built. Aris, the scientist, was the tiebreaker. Haroldar would have to make him understand. He'd have to translate the cold, hard reality of this place into a language the doctor could process. Forget the philosophy of control. This was about a sledgehammer to the foundations. He made his way to a noodle bar at the edge of the market, a cramped space with only 3 stools facing a counter slick with grease. He ordered a bowl of protein broth, the steam warming his face. As he sipped the salty, metallic liquid, he let the undermarket's noise wash over him. He was a part of it, a creature of the decay. And he knew, with the certainty of a lifetime spent in the dark, that their only chance of survival lay not in the high-minded ideals of the spire, but in the grubby, practical, and violent desperation of the depths. The air in Aris's laboratory was a stagnant cocktail of ozone and obsession. It carried the metallic tang of the recycler fighting a losing battle against the cloying sweetness that bled through the bulkheads from the Ossuary Levels 1 floor below. A single naked neon tube on the ceiling flickered in a frantic, dying rhythm, casting the cluttered room in strobing shades of gray and anemic blue. Wires snaked across the floor like dead metallic vines, connecting salvaged consoles and processors into a single straining computational beast. At its heart, Aris Thorne sat hunched, his face illuminated by the glow of the primary monitor, his reflection a gaunt mask of sleeplessness. He hadn't left this room in 3 cycles. Sustenance was a nutrient paste squeezed from a tube, its synthetic algae taste a familiar penance. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Not when he was so close. On the screen, the search algorithm was in its final moments. He had designed it himself, a desperate piece of code built to hunt for a phantom. It sifted through terabytes of Ethelgard's ambient data bleed, stray diagnostic signals, corrupted comms logs, the faint, persistent static that the architects dismissed as system noise. But Aris knew better. Buried in that noise, in that digital sea of decay, was the source of the resonance, the source of her echo.
Lyra. The name was a wound in his mind, still raw. He saw her not as a memory, but as a glitch in his own perception. A brief flash of her smile as she adjusted the focus on a xenobotanical microscope. The scent of genuine soil, a priceless rarity on her hands. The memory was an illicit treasure, a defiance against the great stillness. It was also the engine of his guilt. He watched the progress bar inch forward. 98%. The hum of the overloaded processors pitched higher, a strained whine that vibrated through the metal desk into the bones of his forearms. A drip of condensation, thick and oily, fell from an overhead conduit, striking a discarded data pad with a rhythmic plink, plink, plink that measured out the agonizing passage of time. "Come on," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't fail now. Just show me." He was asking the machine, the station, the void itself. He was pleading with a ghost. The resonance event he'd witnessed, the one the architects had so brutally suppressed, had been different. It wasn't the usual vague moaning or distorted faces that flickered on security monitors. It had felt directed, personal. It was a signal, he was sure of it, and a signal had a point of origin. 99%. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic biological counterpoint to the electronic hum. This was it, the moment of truth. Either he was a scientist on the verge of the single greatest discovery in the station's bleak history, or he was just another echo-lost soul chasing phantoms, his sanity fraying thread by thread. His greatest fear gnawed at him, that this wasn't a discovery, but a diagnosis of his own decay. The screen flashed green. A single soft chime cut through the lab's oppressive drone. It felt impossibly loud. "Query complete." Aris leaned closer, his breath fogging a small patch on the cold glass. The torrent of cascading code and fractured data streams collapsed. The ghost ocean of noise receded, filtered and triangulated by his algorithm until only a single undeniable point remained. It wasn't a complex formula. It wasn't a person's designation or a hidden file directory. It was a location. The text appeared on the screen, stark and absolute, in a plain monospaced font.
Signal origin. Primary node 734 Gamma. Location Aethelgard Station. Sublevel Gamma. Maintenance sector. Asset ID Defunct Comms Relay 7. Status Offline. Unmonitored. Aris stared. The initial surge of adrenaline, the triumphant elation he had anticipated, never came. Instead, a cold wave washed over him, extinguishing the fire of his obsession and leaving behind an icy dread. He read the words again, mouthing them silently. Sublevel Gamma. He sank back in his chair, the worn synth leather groaning in protest. The name was not just a coordinate, it was a verdict. It was a place spoken of only in cautionary tales among the technocrat class, a part of Aethelgard's forgotten anatomy. It wasn't just old, it was primordial, part of the station's original pre-architect construction. A labyrinth of rust and ruin deep in the station's guts, far below the ossuary, bordering the irradiated foundations of the rust gardens. It was a place where maintenance drones went to die, where structural integrity was a hopeful guess, and where the station's official schematics were riddled with corrupted data and vast, uncharted voids. The abstract mystery had just become a concrete mission. The ghost in the machine now had a physical lair. And he, the disgraced academic who lived in a world of theory and data, had to go there. His hands moved with a newfound grim purpose. He dismissed the algorithm's results and pulled up the station's structural archives. He keyed in the coordinates. A schematic flickered to life, a web of faded blue lines on a black background. He found the ossuary levels, then traced the transport shafts and service corridors downward. The neat and orderly lines of the upper station quickly devolved into a chaotic mess. He found sublevel Gamma, a sprawling, cancerous growth on the station's underbelly. Much of it was shaded in red, labeled with terse, ominous warnings. Structural collapse imminent. Atmospheric seal failure. High-level radiation anomaly. Defunct Comms Relay 7 was a single, insignificant pixel deep within that red-shaded nightmare.
Aris stared at the path. It was a journey through the station's decaying flesh, a descent into its forgotten sins. This was no longer an intellectual pursuit. It was no longer about parsing data from the safety of his lab. This would require tools he didn't have, skills he didn't possess. It would require him to leave his sanctuary and step into the very decay he had only ever observed. The flickering neon tube above finally gave out, plunging the room into near-total darkness. Only the pale blue light of the map on the screen remained, illuminating his face. It traced the hard lines of his jaw, the dark circles under his eyes. In the reflection on the dark screen, he saw the face of a man who had finally cornered his ghost, only to find it lived in a tomb. He placed a finger on the screen, the tip touching the glowing pixel that marked Relay 7. The glass was cold. The abstract had become terribly, dangerously real. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that he would go. He had to. The undermarket wasn't a place. It was a symptom, a fever in the station's cold iron bones. Hroldar Brecker moved through it like a ghost, his worn scavenger's coat a perfect camouflage against the grime-slicked bulkheads and weeping pipes. Here, in the unmonitored guts between the rust gardens and the lower residential spires, the station's constant, oppressive hum was layered with the furtive hiss of whispers and the clink of untraceable echoes. The air, thick with the smell of mildew and ozone, carried a cloying sweetness from a nearby fungal farm that never quite masked the metallic tang of recycled water. It was the scent of rot, both biological and societal. Hroldar kept one hand in his pocket, wrapped around the smooth, cool surface of the data chip. A nervous habit, or a practical one. In a place like this, the line between the two blurred until it vanished. He navigated the narrow makeshift alley, stepping over thick power cables that snaked across the floor like dead serpents. Bioluminescent moss pulsed with an eerie turquoise light from cracks in the plasteel, casting long dancing shadows that made every flicker of movement a potential threat. His destination was a small recess, hidden behind a curtain of heavy, treated canvas that stank of chemical preservatives. A single stylized glyph was scorched into the material, an open eye with a data stream for an iris. The broker.
He pushed the curtain aside and stepped into a booth no larger than a maintenance locker. The air inside was startlingly clean, filtered. A figure sat behind a low counter cluttered with diagnostic tools and tangled wires. It was impossible to make out a face or even a gender. They were shrouded in a heavy, dark robe, the hood pulled so low it cast their entire form into shadow. The only visible features were two thin, metallic fingers resting on the console, and the faint crimson glow of what Hroldar assumed were optical augments, observing him from the darkness. "Stillness upon you," the silhouette's voice rasped, a synthesized approximation of a greeting devoid of any sincerity. Hroldar didn't return the pleasantry. The architect's ideology was a joke down here. "I have something. A fragment." The robed figure's crimson optics shifted, focusing on Hroldar's pocket. One of the metallic fingers lifted, beckoning. "The curious are always welcome. The wasteful are not. Show me it's worth my time." Hroldar's jaw tightened. He hated this part, the dance of trust with the untrustworthy. He pulled out the data chip, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. It was a standard military-grade shard, old but robust. The prize he'd risked his neck for, plucked from the floor of the ossuary approach after the architect's sanitation crew had cleared out. He slid it across the counter. "Sample only. You get a string, not the whole weave." The broker's slender fingers closed around the chip with unnerving speed. They slotted it into a port on the console. A series of glyphs and code fragments began to scroll rapidly across a cracked monitor built into the counter's surface. Hroldar watched the broker, not the screen. He trusted his own eyes more than any machine. The silence in the booth stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft click of the console and the distant rhythmic drip of condensation somewhere in the alley outside. Hroldar could feel a familiar tightness in his chest, a phantom echo of the rust garden's contaminated air.
"The encryption is archaic," the broker finally said, the voice a low hum. "Pre-stillness, heavy, layered, military, but sloppy in places, rushed." The crimson optics seemed to brighten, a flicker of genuine interest in the synthetic monotone. "It's a location marker and a key, paired, for a system that isn't on the public schematic. Sublevel Gamma, Ossuary Sector." Hrodar's breath caught. He'd suspected as much, but the confirmation sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He'd hit something real, something the architects had not just abandoned, but actively tried to bury. "How much?" Hrodar asked, his voice low and steady, betraying none of his excitement. The broker's head tilted. The crimson lights seemed to narrow. "You misunderstand. This is not a simple commodity. This isn't scavenged ship parts or a bootleg memory of sunshine. A fragment like this, it's a question. The full data chip, that would be an answer. Answers are worth more than echoes." "I'm not a philosopher," Hrodar grunted. "Give me a number." 20,000 echoes for the fragment. A down payment. Bring me the full chip, and we can discuss a price that would see you living in the spire, far from the rust and the rot." 20,000. More than he'd seen in a decade. It was enough to buy passage off this decaying tomb if a freighter ever came. The thought was a sudden sharp pang of hope he quickly suppressed. Hope was a liability. He nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the next move. Get back to the chip's hiding spot, secure it, then decide whether to sell or to see what prize this key actually unlocked. He reached for the chip, but the broker's metallic fingers stayed on top of it. "A word of caution," the synthesized voice added, an almost friendly tone that was more chilling than any threat. "As a courtesy for bringing me something so interesting." Hrodar's hand froze. He met the gaze of the unseen eyes. "What caution?" "You are not the only one shaking this particular tree. The market has whispers. It's my business to listen. Another player is asking questions, not down here, up top. A technocrat. He's been petitioning for access to maintenance logs, specifically concerning the old comms relays in the Ossuary sector, the same sector your fragment points to." A cold knot formed in Hrodar's stomach. The wary tension that had been his constant companion sharpened into a blade of competitive urgency. He wasn't alone. Who? A scholar. Disgraced, they say, but clever. The broker seemed to enjoy the dramatic pause. The crimson lights pulsed. A xenobiologist, Dr. Aris Thorne. The name was nothing to him, a sound, but the implication was everything. A technocrat, a doctor, someone with access, with knowledge, not a dreg scrabbling in the dark like him. This Thorne wasn't after echoes, he was after the why. And people who chased why were either fools or the most dangerous people on a field guard.
This Thorne could get to the source through official channels, while Hroldar was still trying to find a door. The broker finally released the chip, pushing it back across the counter. He's looking for a signal. You're holding a key. You're both walking toward the same locked room. You should decide if you want to be the one to open it, or the one left standing in the hall when he does. Hroldar snatched the chip, his knuckles white. The 20,000 echoes were suddenly trivial, a consolation prize. The real value wasn't the data itself, but getting to it first. The game had changed. It wasn't a treasure hunt anymore. It was a race. He gave the broker a curt nod, turned and pushed back through the heavy curtain without another word. The undermarket's foul air hit him again, but he barely noticed. The whispers and shadows no longer felt like a passive threat. They felt like a starting pistol. He slipped the chip back into his coat, the smooth surface now feeling less like a promise of wealth and more like a ticking clock. A disgraced xenobiologist, Aris Thorne. The name was now a brand on his thoughts, a rival. Hroldar quickened his pace, melting back into the station's gloom, his mind no longer on selling a prize, but on claiming it. The air in Aris's laboratory was a sterile ghost, thin and cold, tasting of ozone and the metallic tang of recycled water. It offered no comfort. On the central workbench, the holographic display of his neural mapper still held the phantom signature from the ossuary, a jagged, impossible spike of activity where there should have been only the flat line of cellular decay, a memory that refused to be still.
His movements were stiff, automated. He pulled a battered satchel from a locker, the synth leather cracking at the seams. Grief was a poor motivator for scientific rigor, but it was all he had left. He began to pack, a portable field scanner, its casing scarred from a dozen dead worlds, a set of microcalipers, a data slate with a reinforced screen. Each tool felt unnervingly like a weapon. He was not preparing for an expedition. He was preparing for a haunting. His gaze drifted to a small framed photo on the edge of his desk. Lyra. Her smile was a relic from another lifetime, a memory so authentic it felt like contraband here on Ethelgard. The resonance echo hadn't looked like her, not really. It was just a flicker, a distortion in the cryofog, but it had felt like her, a cold echo of her warmth. That was the hook in his soul. He picked up the photo, its simple plastic frame cold against his fingers. Was this redemption, or was it just a more elaborate way to lose himself completely? He didn't know. He only knew he had to go. He slid the photo into the inner pocket of his coat, the fragile image a silent weight against his heart. On the data slate, he keyed in his destination. The wireframe map glowed a faint, sickly blue, a labyrinthine route through service conduits, leading to the decommissioned sector marked OSS, sublevel Gamma. The air in Hroldar Brecker's workshop was thick enough to chew. It smelled of rust, damp earth from the hydroponic trays, and the acrid tang of failing power conduits. Bioluminescent fungi pulsed with an eerie green light in the corners, casting his face in a ghoulish pallor. He was a creature of this decay, a scavenger who thrived where the station was weakest. His world was pragmatic, built of salvaged parts and broken promises. He held the stun prod up to the fungal light, its coils humming with a hungry blue energy. Satisfied, he deactivated it with a practiced flick of his thumb. This wasn't a scientific inquiry for him. It was a job,
a dangerous, high-value extraction. The target wasn't a person, but a place, a whisper on the black market, a rumor from an echo-lost tech who owed him, a glint of encrypted data on the chip he'd plucked from the mud. Sub-level Gamma, a place the architects wanted forgotten. Anything the architects wanted forgotten had value. His expression was a mask of grim calculus. He weighed the risks, architect patrols, system failures, the ghost stories that clung to the ossuary like shroud rot, against the potential reward, enough echoes to buy his way off this decaying hulk. Or, if the data was as unique as the encryption suggested, enough to leverage a life of something other than scraping by in the muck. He pulled the data chip from his pocket. Hooking it to a jury-rigged reader, he watched the stream of corrupted code flicker across a cracked screen. It was meaningless to him, but the complexity was a language he understood, the language of profit. He grunted, a sound of bitter satisfaction. This was worth the risk. He pulled on a heavy coat, its fabric stained with grease and something that might have been algae, and slung a bag of his own over his shoulder. It contained no scanners, only a pry bar, a multi-tool, and a handful of ration bars. His map was a dog-eared schematic marked with his own cryptic symbols indicating hazards and shortcuts. The destination was circled in faded red ink. Gamma. Vespera Lyrian's quarters were an island of absolute stillness. The air was filtered to perfection, carrying a faint, chemically sterile scent designed to promote tranquility. The walls were smooth, unbroken surfaces of gray and cool blue, lit by recessed strips that cast no shadows. It was the architectural embodiment of the great stillness, a space designed to erase the messy chaos of existence. But tonight, chaos was a quiet scream inside her skull. Her fingers, slender and sure, moved across the surface of her private console. The official investigation logs she had just finished filing were a work of fiction. A power surge, a sensor malfunction. She had laid a trail of digital breadcrumbs pointing towards a group of disgruntled dregs in the rust gardens, a convenient and plausible scapegoat, a sacrifice to protect the integrity of a mission she didn't yet understand. With a few keystrokes, she bypassed her standard access and delved into the deep archives of Ethelgard's security network. Her clearance was high, a privilege of her position, but this was a gray area. Monitoring decommissioned sectors without an active alert was frowned upon. She brought up the feeds for the ossuary. The main levels were quiet, rows upon rows of cryogenic pods resting in silent, cold order. Then she navigated deeper. Sub-level Gamma. The feed was grainy, flickering with static. Only 3 cameras were still active, and one was pointed at a wall of corroded pipes. She zoomed in on the primary entrance, a heavy blast door sealed with an archaic, pre-architect maglock. Below the image, a text block glowed. Hazard, structural instability, neural field inconsistencies, access forbidden. Her duty warred with the anomaly she had witnessed. The echo in the harmonization chamber hadn't just been a glitch, it had been a violation. It wore the face of Thorne's wife, but spoke with her grandmother's voice. It was a secret torn from her own mind. The architects demanded stillness, but they were built on lies. Her conscience, a faculty she had been trained to suppress, was screaming. Monitoring this remotely was not enough. Control required proximity. She had to be there, to see who was coming, to contain whatever happened next. Aris zipped his satchel. The sound was sharp, definitive in the oppressive quiet of the lab. In the rust gardens, Herolder holstered his stun prod. The magnetic clamp clicked shut with a heavy metallic finality. In her silent quarters, Vespera stood and pulled on a long dark coat, its high collar obscuring the crisp lines of the architect uniform. The soft rustle of the fabric was the only sound. 3 figures in 3 disparate corners of the dying station, one driven by ghosts, one by greed, one by a crisis of faith. Each took a final look at their surroundings and then turned. In unison, their hands reached for the doors of their separate worlds, ready to step out into the decaying corridors. Their paths, unknown to any of them, were now irrevocably set on a collision course in the forgotten darkness beneath the dead.